Hey, Robert, appreciate you coming on. And what we're going to be talking about is the argument that it's the British that assassinate the American presidents. You are one of the team at PrometheanAction.com, and Susan Kokinda's I'm grateful and thrilled that she comes regularly on my channel. And you're one of the team along with Susan Kokinda and Barbara Boyd. Do you want to just say a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. Well, as you could see from looking at me, I'm not a young guy, and I've been involved in political activity for most of my adult life, almost all of my adult life. For decades, worked very closely with Lyndon LaRouche, who has been slandered and attacked and denounced by all kinds of people, but he was the individual who most shaped my political views on things and other things. For a number of years, was the editor in chief of a magazine called Executive Intelligence Review, which was a sort of a publication. You could describe it as a sort of private intelligence publication. And I was the co-editor of that for a number of years. I Earlier in life, I ran for Congress twice in California. One of the races, I ran against Nancy Pelosi. Uh, and if I had won that race, California would be in much better shape today, but I
Sure.
didn't win it. And uh, I have primarily what I have been doing over recent years is I have been writing books, and I have written uh, about a dozen books, ranging from, well, I'll hold one of them up, The Modern Anglo-Dutch Empire, which is a history of the origins of really the British Empire, but the whole oligarchical Anglo-Dutch financial and banking system. But I've written other things on Machiavelli and Dante, and I've written quite a bit on American history, including biographies of Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin, William McKinley, and that's what I spend most of my time doing right now, is writing. So, uh, I'm a very strong supporter of the Trump administration, and have been fighting to return America to the principles it was founded upon, which I consider to be sacred principles, which unfortunately America has, strayed from quite extensively in the last 20, 30 years or more.
Oh,
So that's sort of what I am, what I'm doing.
Robert, thank you. Okay, well, thank you, Robert. One of the things that you've written, a pamphlet, is it's the British that murder our presidents. Do you want to hold that up? I know you've got that.
Sure. This is the pamphlet, a
It,
police dossier. It is the British who murder our presidents.
okay, and that's available on the Promethean Action website,
It's available.
prometheanaction.com.
It's available on the Promethean Action website.
Yeah, and I recommend people go and check out that website and go get that book. But come on, Robert, seriously, why would the British do that? The British and Americans are allies. We have a special relationship, and the British, they brought civilization and schools to the colonies and Christianity. This is just this is just slanderous and libellous and whatever it is. How can you say such a thing about the British, Robert?
Well, you have to look. You have to look at what the British Empire really was and what it is today. Uh, if you go far enough back in English history, I know less about Scottish and Welsh history, but if you go far enough back in English history, you have people like Shakespeare. You have many, many great people. Um, but the reality is, in 1688, something occurred called the Glorious Revolution, which is celebrated today as a wonderful thing. But people don't understand what actually happened then, which was that the ruler of the Netherlands came in and took over the English throne with his wife. And what they brought with them was the financial and monetary and imperial policies of the Netherlands into England. That's when they established the Bank of England. That's when they established a number of other things. And the and over the course of the 18th century, um, Britain developed into the most powerful empire in the world. And people think, well, they brought civilization. Well, there's this big deal about slavery today. Uh, in the 18th century, the British were the world's largest slave traffickers. They took it over from the Dutch, who had taken it over from the Portuguese. But Britain in 1720, 1730, 1740, the British Empire ran the overwhelming bulk of the transatlantic slave trade. Later, when they got rid of slavery, and people want to make a big deal about how Britain abolished slavery, but when they got rid of slavery, they found something that paid even more money, which was narcotics trafficking. And they set up the opium plantations, and they set up the trafficking in narcotics, and they became the world's first drug cartel, run out of London and run through banks like the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. This is not a benign empire. Um, if you look at the British colonies in the 18th, 19th, early 20th century, in India, in Africa, more people died or were just killed outright or died from starvation and other things. It's like what they did in Ireland, but in the colonies, more people were killed by the British Empire than by Adolf Hitler. That's just factually true, and this has never been. If you look at American history from 1775, from the Battle of Lexington and Concord, all the way up to the First World War, Great Britain was considered the enemy of the United States. It was considered our strategic adversary. And the vast majority of Americans understood that. It only began to change with the First World War. And then it really changed after the Second World War. When Winston Churchill gave his speech in Fulton, Missouri, and said, "An iron curtain has come down on Eastern Europe, and America and Britain must join together to fight for democracy and freedom," and you get the creation of the Anglo American Alliance, something which would have been unthinkable for most of American history. And since 1945, that is how we have operated in very, very, very close partnership with the City of London, the British ruling class. This is the so-called special relationship. Our British cousins, don't we love them? Um, but uh, and if you look at British imperial and banking policy, um, in the 1960s, Britain set up. This was actually done by the British government and by the Bank of England. They set up the whole offshore banking operation in the Caribbean, in the Cayman Islands, in Panama, in the Dutch Antilles, and elsewhere. This was all set up by London. And this then led into what today we call globalization. Globalization, people say the British Empire doesn't exist anymore. It absolutely does. Because what you have to recognize is the British Empire, first and foremost, forget all the gunboats and all of this stuff and, the charge of the Light Brigade, forget all that stuff. The British Empire, first and foremost, has always been a financial empire, a monetary empire. And that globalization is just a new form of that. And we are at a point right now where this entire post-war paradigm since 1945, we're on the brink of a new era where that is step by step being jettisoned by the Trump administration, and America is reasserting its sovereign power around the ideas of peace and economic development. This is
Robert,
yeah,
let me
yeah, yeah.
stop you there. Um, bloody hell. That's really what's there, right? Bloody hell. I mean, I'm listening to you. Huh? This happens so often on my channel, and people will say something. It's like, what? Happens a lot with Susan, by the way. What? I didn't know
Right.
this. I didn't know. I knew the British Empire was cruel. right? Because I was born in Pakistan. My parents were refugees from India, and I've read about Indian history under the British and killing 20 million people. And this is what the Europeans did. The Belgians killed 6 million in the Congo.
Yeah,
But I was brought up in a world. I was born in a world where the UK and the US were are, like you said, close cousins, special relationship. Thatcher and Reagan, Blair and Bush, right?
yeah,
All
yeah, yeah.
chummy chum, everybody chummy chummy. But I didn't know that they were strategic enemies. You said from 1775 to 1914. Now, 1776 was the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
1913 was the setting up of the Federal Reserve. So I wonder if those bookends had something to do with it, right? And 1914 was the start of the First World War. But
Yeah, go ahead.
my question is, and feel free to add anything that you think might be useful, because we are going to get into how the British murdered the presidents, and in particular McKinley, Lincoln, and JFK.
Right.
And we think possibly attempted an assassination on Trump. But why were they strategic? How can you say they were strategic enemies? We're divided by a common language, Christian nations.
Well, look at what rather than answer that directly,
Sure.
what I'd like to make this. I'd like to make a point about where we are today,
Okay.
and I want to just read to you. This is very short. Um, 3 speeches that were recently delivered by leading leaders of the British government and NATO. And this is all within the last 10, 11 days. So this is not history. This is what's going on right now. And on December 11th, the Minister of the British Armed Forces, a man named Alistair Cairns, gave a speech in which he said Britain must begin preparing for war against Russia. That same day, a man named Mark Rutte, who's the Secretary General of NATO, also gave a speech in which he also said that Europe must prepare for war against Russia. And then he said, on the scale of what our grandparents and great grandparents endured. That's a direct quote. Now, he's talking about his grandparents and great grandparents. They're talking about World War I and World War II. So he's saying, he's the head of NATO. He's saying Europe must prepare right now for a war against Russia on the scale of World War I or World War II. That's the president of NATO saying that out loud in a speech only about a week ago. And then on December 15th, Blaise Metrowelli, I think is how you pronounce it, Blaise Metrowelli, who is the new head of MI6, which is British intelligence. He's the new head of MI6, or it might be a woman. I can't.
It's a woman.
Yeah, it's a woman.
Yeah.
She said that that quote, the West is at the threshold of war. That's what she said, the threshold of war, and must mobilize for war against Russia. So here you have the head of MI6, the head of the British Armed Forces, and the Secretary General of NATO all saying we must prepare for a war, a general war against Russia now.
Okay.
That's what's being said. Now, I want to counterpose to that the document that was released by the Trump administration in November, so about a month ago, which is a document entitled National Security Strategy for the USA, in which what is laid out by Trump and the people who probably actually wrote the document, but certainly approved by Trump, what is laid out by the Trump administration is a strategic doctrine, the exact opposite of what the British are calling for right now and what NATO is calling for. What's laid out in this national security document is several things, but just number one, peace, not war. Peace. That is our strategy. 2, an end to globalization. And 3, that we are going to reorient our economic policies around the development of the productive economy. That is manufacturing and similar things, agriculture, but the productive economy to expand employment, real economic growth, etc. So what are they talking about? Peace, economic development, no war, no globalization. This puts the Trump administration in direct conflict with what the elites of Great Britain and NATO are saying. We're at a moment of profound change in the world, but it is also a moment of great, great danger. So that's what I wanted to say.
Robert, thank you so much for that. And I've read the National Security Strategy, and I did pick that out. And I also did a video with your colleague Susan Kokinda from Promethean Action on the National Security Strategy. And it's anti-globalist, pro-peace, and pro-economic development for the US. And actually says we'll work with other countries around the world that also want that. But going back to what I said earlier about the hostility between the US and the UK, as you said, between 1775 to 1913, where the UK was regarded as a strategic enemy. Now, is that because, and I've said this in my videos, that the United Kingdom, or England, or whatever it was then, lost this valuable, rich resource of a colony in 1776, and they were really, really pissed off about it.
Yeah, that's part of it. That is part of it. But not only were they really pissed off about it, I mean, this is a subject which a lot of people have a hard time dealing with because there's all these lies and slanders about America. Oh, America! I mean, you saw it in this Ken Burns documentary, which was awful. You know, the America was built on slavery. America was built on stealing the lands of the Indians. It's the evil white men who stole the land and enslaved people and what have you, and all this nonsense.
Well, hold on. I don't adhere to the evil white people, right? I think there's good and evil in all, right?
Right, that's right.
Views, right? But the United States did profit from slavery, and it was occupied by Native Americans, and the European colonialists came along and took that land.
Yeah, but the thing is, first of all, the United States did not profit from slavery, and there were many studies done of this, particularly by Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor, a man named Henry Carey, who was a leading advisor to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and he was really the greatest American economist of the 19th century. And he did studies in which he proved that slavery had massively impoverished the South, massively impoverished it, and stymied and sabotaged any real productive economic development in the South, which is why when the Civil War broke out, the South had no chance of winning. They had no factories, they had no railroads, they had, it was a completely backwards place based on slave labor. But let me read to you a quote from Henry Carey, and this is a very short quote. You're talking about why have we really been enemies all this time, for all this time. This is this is right before the Civil War. This is in the 1850s. And Henry Carey wrote a book called The Harmony of Interests. And in that book, he said, and this is a direct quote, "Two systems are before the world. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other system looks to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, and civilization. One system looks toward universal war. The other system looks toward universal peace. One is the English system. The other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world." That's the quote from Henry Carey. And, it wasn't just that the British were pissed off or really resentful that America had had the audacity to declare independence and rebel. It was, you're looking at two systems, an imperial system and the American Republic, which obviously is not flawless. There have been many mistakes and errors in American history, but the principles behind the American Republic, the principles in the Declaration, the principles in the preamble to the U.S. Constitution define a type of government, a type of nation, a republic, which is the opposite of imperial rule. Imperial rule is based on exploitation, looting, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, obviously Britain was not the only empire. You had the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, and others. And then you had other empires going way back in history, Roman Empire, etc. And these are all bad. This is oligarchical society. But once you get into the 18th to 19th century, all these other empires, they still were around. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, they still had their little colonies, in the 1890s. But once you get into the middle of the 19th century, it is the British Empire really running the world. They are the paramount empire. So anyway, let me stop talking. You can say something.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Okay. So now that is something Alex Craner, who's a regular guest on my channel, he also says it is a conflict between two systems of governance, which is the extractive imperial system, where, okay, we're going to use financial leverage nowadays rather than military conquest in order to extract resources, extract collateral, which we can then use to lever up the banking system, versus the American system of political economy, which my understanding is what McKinley put in place and Lincoln wanted to put in place and JFK wanted to put in place, which is that have tariffs. I'm not saying they were successful in this, by the way. Have tariffs for goods coming in, no income tax, and that the revenue for the tariffs was what paid for government, but also allowed the government to direct credit towards productive enterprises, to produce things, to invent things. And then that elevated everybody's wealth. But one point I made to Susan when she and I recorded recently is I remember watching Happy Days, the Fonz, right?
I remember.
You remember that Happy Days, right? And that was a 4-person family on one income. And they had a nice lifestyle. They had a couple of cars at least, right? They had a nice middle-class lifestyle on one income. You can't do that now.
That was the norm. Look, people don't realize that was the norm. I grew up, as I said, I'm not a young guy. I grew up in the 1950s, and I grew up in a town that was about 30 to 40 miles north of New York City. It was suburbia, in those days. A little different than suburbia today. We didn't have all these chain stores and everything. But, where I grew up, it was not a wealthy neighborhood. My father was a railroad worker. The family next to us, he was a carpenter. My family's best friend. He was a prison guard. I mean, this was, it was middle class, middle class,
Yeah.
and they were all one income families. That you had a father who worked. In some of the families, once the kids were in school, the wife might get a part-time job. But in some of the families, the wife didn't work at all. But the father worked, and most of these families had at least 3 or 4 kids. Some had 5 or 6 kids or more, but 3, 4, 5 kids on one income, a middle class, standard of living on one income. And that has been completely destroyed in the last 40 years, totally destroyed. And so you want to wonder why it's such a crisis with young people today and growing up. I mean, there's all kinds of inputs into it, but family life has just been destroyed in the United States.
Yeah.
Destroyed.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't have both parents working full time and you ship your kids off to daycare and then you only see them at night or something. And of course, both parents, since both parents are working full time, you don't have family dinners anymore. You don't, where people sit around and talk. It's parents are too tired to help their kids with their homework. Family life has been destroyed in the United States.
Absolutely, and the same here, and it's through the financialization.
It is
of the economy, particularly after 1971. But I want to take it back to the presidents that were murdered by the British.
Right.
So what was in common with these three, McKinley, Lincoln, and JFK? And were there any other ones that were doing this, that were doing the same stuff?
Well, there were, but let's just sort of, for time's sake, focus for the moment on Lincoln and McKinley and JFK. And there were 2 things that I'm not saying these are the only things, but there were 2 things I think that you've got to think about. One was they all were champions of the American system of economics. of the development of the productive economy. And they did it in different ways. And you could even go back to Alexander Hamilton, because we have what we call the American system of economics, which is the opposite of financialization, right? It says money is not wealth; it's the development of your productive economy. Um, being driven by science, technology, upward progress that benefits the people as a whole. That's the real measuring rod for societal wealth, the American system of political economy. And if you look at Hamilton, who really invented the American system, but then you look at Lincoln, you look at McKinley, you look at JFK, they were all supporters of the American system of economics. Now, they didn't all do exactly the same thing. They approached it in different ways because they're living at completely different eras. So they did it in different things. Lincoln had the greenbacks. He also had high tariffs. McKinley was
But what are
very.
the greenbacks?
The greenbacks were the constitutional paper currency that were issued by the U.S. government during the Civil War. These were issued by the Treasury Department. Unlike the Federal Reserve notes today, which are really completely unconstitutional, the Federal Reserve notes. The Constitution is very clear. Only the U.S. government can emit money. Only the U.S. government. And what Lincoln did was, during the Civil War, they had several issuances. They did it 2 or 3 times at least, maybe 4, but 2 or 3 times at least, where the U.S. Treasury printed hundreds of millions of dollars of paper U.S. currency. They called them greenbacks, and these were then.
And this wasn't borrowed into existence like his.
No, this wasn't borrowed. They didn't borrow it. They just printed it.
Right.
And it wasn't borrowed from anybody. But these were then loaned out to banks around the country, not just the Wall Street banks, or even primarily the Wall Street banks, but all over the country. The money was circulated. It was used to pay the soldiers. It was loaned out to banks, and it was put into general circulation as a way both to finance the war effort, but also to finance the massive manufacturing and industrial growth that took place during the war. The greenbacks were all withdrawn by 1880, 1878, 1879. The greenbacks were withdrawn. And then we did not have a U.S. paper currency until the Federal Reserve came along. But then they began issuing Federal Reserve notes, which they had no legal authority to do, because the Federal Reserve is not the U.S. Treasury. It's independent. And Federal Reserve notes have no constitutional legitimacy whatsoever. And that's what we have as money today. So anyway, all 3 of these presidents were supporters of the American system of economics. But they were also trying to, in the case of Kennedy, it's a little different. But in the case of Lincoln and McKinley, they were enemies of the British Empire. They recognized the British Empire and the imperial system of that empire as a strategic danger to the United States. Now, with Kennedy, it's a little different. What Kennedy was trying to do was, as discussed earlier, between 1945 and 1950, with Winston Churchill and Harry Truman and everything else, lots of different inputs, the United States gets sucked into this special relationship with Great Britain and the Cold War. The United States and Great Britain are partners, shoulder to shoulder, against godless communism, and that really dominated, the entirety of the 1950s going into the 1960s. But then Kennedy began to break with that. He began to break with it, and he gave a speech, very famous speech, at American University, about 4 months or so before he was assassinated. And sometimes this is called his peace speech. And if we have time, I can read you a couple paragraphs from it, but you can get it online. It's the American University speech of John F. Kennedy, in which he says explicitly, we have to end this. We have to find peace in the world. And he says, not the peace of conquest, not the peace of arms, but genuine, lasting peace between nations. And Kennedy was determined to escape from this Cold War, structure, and to realign global relations around peaceful relations among nations in the same way Trump is trying to do today. If you think of those quotes I read to you from, NATO and the British people today saying we got to prepare for war against Russia, and Trump is saying no, I'm for peace. This is not that much different. It's different times. It's 60 years ago, but Kennedy was trying to do the same thing. He was killed. But I, and if you want me to keep talking, I could tell you a little bit about. It's up to you. But
No, Robert, thank you, thank you. I do appreciate the opportunity to interject, but also I'd like to let you flow and talk. It's absolutely fascinating.
Because I want to tell you the real story of the Civil War at some point.
Oh, go ahead then. Go on then.
Because there's how many books have been written about the Civil War, and how many movies have been made about the Civil War, and the war between the states, and brother against brother, and the Confederacy fighting. If you're anti-Confederacy, your Confederacy fought for slavery. If you're pro-Confederacy, they fought to defend themselves against the tyranny of Washington D.C. And all this nonsense. And look, the secret to the Civil War is that it is not exactly, but it is in principle at least, almost identical to what we're seeing now in Ukraine. Because what is the Ukraine?
Robert, hold on a second before you go. Right, I don't know where you're going to go. I'm going to hazard a guess based upon my understanding of the mischief and the Machiavellian machinations of MI6 and those that it acts on behalf.
Right.
Was it the British?
Yes. Yes.
Stirring up the ants, right? Divide and rule, Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Yeah. Oh,
Pakistan and India, North and South Cyprus, Palestine and Israel, and all those other straight lines across the former Ottoman Empire.
They've been doing it for centuries.
They're the experts at it.
They're experts at it. They may be evil, but they're not dumb. And the look, what is the Ukraine war really? Forget this thing about Ukraine. We got to defend Ukraine. Blah blah blah. The Ukraine war is a NATO proxy war against Russia. That's what it is.
They want the resources.
And that's what it's been all along. That's what the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe was all about. And the targeting of Russia. And look at the war itself. Sure, there are no large numbers of NATO troops or British troops fighting in the Ukraine. But where does Ukraine get their money to wage the war? Where do they get their armaments, their ammunition, their missiles? Where do they get their supplies? Where do they get all the aid they need? It's all coming in from NATO. NATO is supplying everything to keep this war going. Well, that's exactly what happened in the Civil War. First of all, the Civil War was really the Southern secession was led by a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was created out of British intelligence by Giuseppe Mazzini and Lord Palmerston. They created the Knights of the Golden Circle, and these were the people who led the secessionists. And but then you look at the war itself. The Confederacy was financed from London through a man named George Trenholm, who was the Confederate banker. He was the banker for the Confederacy, and he had offices in London and the Bahamas, both on British Empire soil. And the money was channeled through Trenholm into the Confederate government. When the war broke out, the Southern Army had some, armaments and rifles and ammunition, but they were all used up within 6 to 12 months. They were, and essentially the Southern Army would have collapsed by 1862, except that the British began shipping massive amounts of armaments into the South, and I mean massive. At the Battle of Gettysburg, which is everyone knows the Battle of Gettysburg. Almost all of the Confederate troops, almost all of them, Longstreet's troops, Pickett's troops, Robert E. Lee's troops, almost all of those soldiers were carrying British Enfield rifles, which had been imported from London. Their ammunition, their artillery was all brought in from London. And by 1864 and 1865, the British were actually feeding the Confederate Army huge shipments of food. When Grant took over Petersburg, the siege of Petersburg, which is near Richmond, and took over Petersburg, he found that all of the Confederate troops that had been resisting him, that they were all living off of provisions, bacon and other provisions that had been shipped from England. England fed the Confederate soldiers, armed the Confederate soldiers, financed the Confederacy, and it was a proxy war. Britain wanted to use the secession to destroy the American Republic, to destroy us, and then you get
doing it again right now.
Yeah, they're doing it again right now. And then of course you get into the assassination and all of that. I mean,
okay, well, let's get into that. But before you do that, I just want to make a point. A lot of the history that you're talking about, in fact, most of what you're talking about is unknown to me.
right.
I was schooled in Britain. I went to infant school and primary school and high school and university in Britain. My children were home educated. My 18-year-old and 21-year-old, I'm proud to say, never went to school. And my little girl, when she was about 10, 11, got very interested in Queen Victoria. And she went with her friend and another home ed mum to the local library to read about Queen Victoria and the Raj in India. And she came back with this book that talked about the first Indian mutiny.
Right.
Which is when the Indians revolted against British rule. And it was called, they mutinied.
Yeah.
I said to my daughter, if you go and read a book in Pakistan or India about that, they call it the first Indian War of Independence.
Right.
So it's like, the history books are completely biased. So it's no wonder I don't know about it.
Well, as they say,
it was against slavery.
Right. History books are written by the victors,
Yeah.
Written by the victors, not the ones who lose.
Yes. And they're only one angle, one particular perspective, because I'm sure, how Russia's going to write the account of the war in Ukraine is going to be very different to how the Ukrainians or Zelensky or the Azov people or the Banderistas are going to write about it.
Right.
Right? Okay. So now tell us about, which was the first one, Lincoln.
Yeah, well, let me just say, I'll go through Lincoln and McKinley, and then we can get to Kennedy if you want. But I would, again, urge people to get the pamphlet because I'm only going to be able to give you just the briefest of sketches here.
Yeah. By the way, it's a fascinating sketch, and I really like the way you laid out the context for the whole thing. So thank you for that.
Sure. Look, during the Civil War, you had the Confederate government set up something called the Confederate Secret Service, which is a secret service.
Trained by the British, perhaps.
Well, here's the story. The Confederate Secret Service had 3 headquarters. Ostensibly, it was headquartered in Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy, and the head of it was Judah Benjamin, who was I forget his position in the Confederacy, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
He was the Secretary of State for the Confederacy. But Judah Benjamin actually was born in the West Indies, and he was a British subject. So he's a British subject. He's the vice president of the Confederacy. And he was ostensibly the head of the British Secret Service. But in actuality, the Confederate Secret Service, excuse me. In actuality, the 2 main headquarters, operational headquarters for the Confederate Secret Service were in London and in Montreal. And Montreal is part of Canada, which is part of the British Empire. And that's where the Secret Service was based. Now, there are a number of people who were involved in this, a whole group of people, a man named James Bullock, George Sanders, Jacob Thompson, Clement Clay. There's a whole bunch of people involved in this. Most of them had spent a great deal of time in London where they were on intimate terms, visited him, attended, group discussions at his house of a man named Giuseppe Mazzini. And Mazzini ran a European-wide terrorist uh, apparatus, which carried out political assassinations. Mazzini actually had a theory, which he called the theory of the dagger, which said that, for these tyrants, these dictators, these oppressors, we must take the dagger to them. In other words, we must kill them. Like, they said, we're going to be like Cassius and Brutus, who stabbed Julius Caesar to death. This is what we're going to do to these tyrants. And this is Mazzini. And Mazzini was actually lived at the home and otherwise was sponsored for many years by Lord Palmerston, who was the British Prime Minister. So Palmerston is overseeing Mazzini. Mazzini is recruiting all of these terrorists and radicals and what have you, and he's on intimate terms with all of the leaders of the Confederate Secret Service in London. Now, at a certain point, a number of these London-based Confederate Secret Service people moved to Canada, to Montreal. Not all of them, but a number of them did. And they got money from various sources within the British aristocracy to do this, to set up operations in Montreal. And and that is where John Wilkes Booth was deployed from. John Wilkes Booth was not some crazy lone assassin, just mentally disturbed individual. He was a member of the Confederate Secret Service. He had earlier been a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. He was an intelligence agent, and he made several trips to Montreal, where he met with some of the people that I talked about, particularly a guy named George Sanders. He received money from them. He also met with some of these Canada-based operatives in New York State and in Boston. And it was immediately following the one of the meetings in Boston that he came back to Washington, D.C., and when the assassination of Lincoln was carried out. This is what actually happened. And I'll read to you something. Again, it's very short, but this was a statement issued by President Andrew Johnson, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated. In 18 days after Lincoln was assassinated, President Andrew Johnson issued a proclamation where he said, and this is a direct quote, "It appears from evidence in the Bureau of Military Justice that the atrocious murder of President Abraham Lincoln and the attempted assassination of the Secretary of State William Seward were incited, concerted, and procured by and between Jefferson Davis, Jacob Thompson, Clement Clay, George Sanders, William Cleary, and other rebels and traitors against the government of the United States harbored in Canada." So what he names here, Clement Clay, Jacob Thompson, George Sanders, these are the people operating out of Montreal who had come to Montreal from London, who were being financed through networks around the British government. These are the people who Johnson names as the originators of the plot to assassinate Lincoln. Now, what happened later is that a decision was made, and I'm not exactly sure why the decision was made, not to go after this Canada-based apparatus. The whole assassination plot came out of Canada. But the decision was made not to try to prosecute these people. First of all, almost none of them were in the United States. They were either in Canada or in London, so it would have been very hard to prosecute them. But the decision was made not to go after these people, and instead they just prosecuted. John Wilkes Booth got killed trying to escape, and then he had a series of people, in Baltimore and Washington that had carried out these attacks against Seward and others who were involved in the plot. These are sort of the lower level people, and the decision was made to limit the prosecutions to them. So they were the people who were prosecuted. Several of them were convicted and hung, Mary Surratt and others. But this higher level Confederate Secret Service Canada-based operation, they were never brought to justice. But that's where the whole thing was carried out. And again, that's a really quick sketch, and you'll have to read the pamphlet or read my biography of Abraham Lincoln to get a fuller picture on it.
Right.
But
We'll link uh, to those in the description below. We can move on then to McKinley,
yeah,
he was president from 1896, I think it was.
he was elected in 1896.
Right. Okay. Okay. So what was he served one term and then he was killed, I think, at the beginning of his second term. Is that right?
Yeah, it's well. One of the things that's sort of funny is that if you look at not, it's not funny, but it's maybe not coincidental. If you look at Lincoln and McKinley and Kennedy, and then also you look at the attempted assassination attempt against Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. All of these, I mean, particularly if the assassination of Trump had been successful, um, all of these kept those presidents from serving a second term.
Okay.
Right? Lincoln was assassinated at the beginning of his second term. McKinley was assassinated at the beginning of his second term. Kennedy was assassinated at the going towards the end of his first term, but he would have been reelected. And this simply was not going to be allowed. Just like
Okay.
they didn't want Trump to get back in.
What was McKinley's first term like for Americans, and why was it a threat to the British?
Well, I'll just say two things. One was, McKinley was Mr. Protectionism. The highest protective tariffs in American history, even higher than Lincoln's tariffs, the Morrill tariff during the Civil War, and that was very high. But McKinley had the highest protective tariffs in American history. Massive, massive economic development. In the United States, in terms of manufacturing, infrastructure, industry, transportation, railroads, and you name it, shipbuilding, everything. New technology, new manufacturing, agricultural growth, massive productive economic development under McKinley, to the point where by the early 20th century, American productive power was beginning to outstrip by far the productive economy of Great Britain, by far. So that's number one. But the second thing is that one of the slanders against McKinley, and I deal with this in depth in the biography I wrote of McKinley because it's really a disgusting slander. One of the slanders against McKinley is that he was the father of American imperialism. He fought the Spanish-American War. He seized the Philippines. He seized Cuba. This was the beginning of the American empire. And it was the exact opposite in reality. And I go through this in depth in the biography I wrote of him. It was the opposite. What he was doing was he was trying to replace, he was trying, like Trump is doing today, he was trying to create a new paradigm in the world. And it was to replace, because look, what existed in the world in the 1880s and 1890s? What existed? You had the Spanish Empire, which still had all these colonies. You had the Dutch Empire, which still ran Indonesia, the Belgian Empire, which ran the Congo, and you had the British Empire, and they were all over the place. Plus, you had the beginnings. It was still small, but you had the beginnings of a growing Japanese empire. These were empires. This was imperial rule. This was looting the native populations. And McKinley's policy was, we're going to have a new approach to this. We're going to reorient world affairs around sovereign nations and around mutually economic development, which benefits everyone, And he called this.
Robert, I'm just going to interrupt you. That's the national security strategy that's Trump's administration. And
That's
also
right.
That was JFK's approach as well.
That's right. And McKinley had a term for it. He called it reciprocity. And if you want to get a sense of it, McKinley was assassinated at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. The day before, one day before his assassination, he gave the keynote speech at that Pan American Exposition. It is easy to find online. William McKinley Pan American Exposition speech. Just search for it, you'll find it. Read that speech, because what he lays out is a policy of friendship, peace, cooperation, no empire, and the reciprocity. We're going to be partners with countries. We're going to develop the economy for everyone. This is what McKinley was doing, and and it was very similar. I mean, if you look at,
and Trump has said similar stuff, and he references McKinley in many of his speeches, even before he was running for election.
right.
Carry on, Robert.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's more I could say on that, but McKinley was without question. I mean, he's really belittled in the history books, but he was without question one of the three or four or five greatest presidents in American history, and he was moving the world in a different direction, out of the rule of empires into the rule of sovereign nations cooperating together. And people say, well, he seized the Philippines, he seized Cuba. Well, he never even really wanted the Philippines. That fell into his lap, because the Spanish basically forced the United States to take the Philippines at the peace treaty. But Cuba, the real cause of the Spanish-American War was Cuba. And people should take a look at what was going on in Cuba at that time. Cuba was under the rule of the Spanish Empire, and it was absolutely brutal colonial rule, brutal, mass poverty, mass murder, no civil rights, de facto slavery for most of the population. And I tell you, leading up to the outbreak of war, you had people in Cuba begging the United States to come in and liberate them, begging the United States, please help us. We're living under a Spanish tyranny. Help us. So we fought the war, and guess what? Within 5 years, Cuba was independent. We kicked out the Spanish, helped reorganize things a little bit in Cuba, and granted Cuba its independence. This was not an imperial policy, So anyway.
Okay, so then, no, the other thing that I know that happened with McKinley around about the same time is other countries were looking at adopting the American system of political economy because the United States was booming. And that was a threat to British imperial rule. And I just want to make a slight detour to contemporary North Africa and Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso, because it strikes me that what he's doing in Burkina Faso is very similar, if not exactly the same or whatever, to the American system of political economy, where he's kicked out the colonialists and he's developing the nation for the sake of the Burkina Faso people.
Well, that could be. I know almost nothing about that situation. So
that'll be your next book, Robert.
But we're seeing this in a lot of countries now, and it's very difficult because you can even, forget about the British. Look at the crazy French. They're doing everything they can to try to maintain their, post-colonial power in Africa, and these are imperial policies. And the individual you mentioned is right. They don't shy away from promoting civil war and tribal war and all kinds of wars and assassinations where people get killed. But the old sort of naked gunboat diplomacy of the 19th century, that's not how they operate anymore. It's financial domination and economic domination. And then if they need to use force to enforce that, they're willing to do that. But it's keeping people under the thumb of the central banking system, the International Monetary Fund, the City of London, Wall Street, globalization, keeping people under that thumb.
Yeah. And just another point for people who don't know, up until the Federal Reserve, the United States didn't have a central bank.
Right.
It had many thousands of regional banks, which are much better because they're decentralized. They serve the local community. But let's go back to McKinley, because we still got to get onto JFK, right? And Trump. Right? So how were the British involved in killing McKinley?
Yeah, well,
according to.
I mean, one of the things you can't do, even in the case of Lincoln, which is Lincoln is very clear, but even in the case of Lincoln, and people want to connect the dots,
Mhm.
and and you really can't connect the dots, but you can, I think, really demonstrate. First of all, you have to recognize, like I said, you look at John Kennedy's American University speech. And you have to recognize, like with Trump today, you have to recognize what a threat this was, a life and death threat to the post-war Anglo-American imperial world order that Kennedy enunciated at American University. And you have to recognize that uh, the British oligarchy and their related friends in various circles, which in the case of Kennedy extended into the CIA and other agencies, they're willing to kill people. They're willing to carry out assassinations if it's a life and death threat to their power, to what they represent. Now, in the case of McKinley, it's very similar, because by the time you get to McKinley, you have to realize it's sort of like today. I mean, we're living right now, in an era of assassinations. I mean, have had two assassination attempts against Trump. Other people have been assassinated.
The,
Charlie Kirk
the,
was
the
assassinated.
Russian the Russian general.
Russian general just this morning, I think it was, or yesterday,
Yep.
was assassinated. Charlie Kirk was assassinated. Look, you have this guy, I forget his name, this health CEO who was shot down, excuse me, on the streets of New York City. And they've turned, the left has turned his assassin into some kind of folk hero. He's a folk hero. We're in an era where people are no longer shocked or surprised by assassinations. It's become, and this is very dangerous, very dangerous. But it's become a situation now where people almost accept this as, oh well, someone might be assassinated. Now, in the case of McKinley, this was definitely the case. What you had during the late 19th, early 20th century was you had the development of what are sometimes called anarchist networks. I mean, it's a very, it's not a it's by no means a uniform sort of thing, but these various anarchist terrorists who again, it's not as precise as it was with Lord Palmerston and Mazzini, where these people are literally operating out of boardrooms in London. But nevertheless, you had various anarchist networks, but the headquarters. It's not that they all were there, but sort of the recognized hub of where many of the leading anarchists gravitated and where they lived for years and associated with each other was London. And in London, and they had newspapers and pamphlets in which they openly called for assassinations and killing people and what have you. Emma Goldman had this newspaper called The Torch, which she published in London, which openly called for political assassinations, and she was by no means the only one. And while they're in London, they're rather than British government saying, "Oh, these people are dangerous. They're supporting political assassinations. We have to round them up. We have to arrest them." No, the opposite was the case. These people were protected by the British aristocracy. Emma Goldman was brought in. When she wanted to go to England, had trouble getting in. And Emma Goldman, who was leading anarchist, originally from Russia, then America, then London, she had trouble getting into England. And who sponsored her entrance into England? Who basically used his influence to get her into England? Lord Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell got Emma Goldman into England. Now, the guy who assassinated McKinley, a guy named Leon Czolgosz, was one of these anarchists, and and he was active in these anarchist circles for a number of years in the Midwest and on the East Coast and elsewhere in New Jersey. And I go into this in some detail in the book, but there's a very, very tightly knit together group of people, and they are openly carrying out assassinations or calling for assassinations. And they had a name for what they were doing. Mazzini called it the theory of the dagger.
Yes, you
Use the
said earlier.
dagger to
You
type.
said earlier. And what? Listen,
But
I'm
let me
thinking
let
of.
me just let me
Sure.
just say this. What the anarchists called it, the theory of the dagger, that was 50 years earlier. The anarchists had a motto they called the propaganda of the deed. Propaganda of the deed. But it meant the same thing. That, political propaganda is not simply printing leaflets and carrying out verbal or written propaganda, but real propaganda is the propaganda of the deed. And the deed is bombings, violence, and assassinations. You carry out the deed. And these people, I mean, they there were dozens of assassinations in the 1890s and early 1900s. Dozens of assassinations of the, the. Uh, I mean, I don't know if I have it here. Yeah, well, among other people, the president of France was assassinated. The Spanish premier was assassinated. The Empress of Austria was assassinated. The King of Italy was assassinated. The Tsar of Russia was assassinated. I mean, kings, prime ministers, czars, and those are just the big names. There were dozens and dozens of assassinations carried out by this anarchist network, and um, and uh, uh, and they openly promoted it, openly called for it, and Shogos, who killed McKinley, was a student and protege of Emma Goldman and met with her on several occasions in New York, in at her home, I think in Ohio. I think it was in Ohio. Uh, um, Attended lectures by her, met with her only, I think it was 1 to 2 weeks before the assassination, met with Emma Goldman. Then he went to the headquarters of the Anarchists International, or U.S. headquarters of the Anarchists in Chicago, and spent several days there meeting with top anarchist leaders, and then took a train to Buffalo where he killed McKinley. Again, this is not a lone assassin. This is not a crazed individual. This is someone groomed and recruited into this type of activity. That McKinley was a tyrant on the order of the Tsar of Russia, on the order of the King of Italy. He was a tyrant. He must be murdered. The propaganda of the deed. And it was carried out. And it was.
Robert, Robert, thank you. And I can see listening to see parallels with what's happening today, where we have Barack Obama uh, hanging out in London, going into Downing Street, meeting who else we don't know. Barack Obama, who headed up the Russiagate coup against Trump in his first term, at the behest of MI6, doing the work of MI6 over in the US. Then also Antifa. I can see how they operate parallels. This anarchist group that you talked about, and then people like George Soros and Bill Gates, who are outspoken. Putting their money wherever they want to put it. And the way people talk about Trump is a dictator, Trump is a tyrant. So completely demonized.
The worst thing is, and it's now become acceptable, right? In the left wing and even establishment news media, in New York Times and what have you, is Trump is Hitler. Trump is Hitler.
Trump
And then, of course, people pose this question: if you could somehow get in a time capsule, and if you time machine, and if you could go back in time to 1932 and assassinate Hitler before he took power in Germany, wouldn't that be the right thing to do? Wouldn't it be right to assassinate Hitler? So that's the question that's posed. Now, if you say, "Oh yes, I wish I could do that," that would obviously be the right thing to do, to kill Hitler before he killed everyone else. Well, if you accept that, but then if you also accept that Trump and Hitler are the same thing, then aren't you justified to kill Trump?
it
You
just
know,
creates that environment, and
that's the
they're not,
environment. That's
they're
the
not the
environment
same
we're in
thing.
today.
They're,
You know,
they're, they're not at all the same thing.
look, I'll just say one thing before we go on. We published this pamphlet about 2 years ago. I don't know the exact month it came out. It was about 2 years ago. It was before the Butler assassination attempt, before it. But I would argue that today, the threat of assassination against Trump and other people, maybe J.D. Vance, we saw Charlie Kirk, the threat of assassinations is higher today than it was when we published this pamphlet. We're in a very dangerous situation because what Trump is doing is, you know, he's changing the world, and he's changing the world in ways which very, very powerful people do not want to see happen.
And he's up against a really, really powerful opponent.
Yeah.
The City of London and its proxies, the remnants of the British Empire and the European elites, incredibly powerful opponents because they look what they did to McKinley and Lincoln and now JFK.
Yeah.
How was JFK? Come on, that was a lone shooter on a grassy. It was the mafia.
Yeah, the mafia, the CIA, all this. Look, I can't go into the JFK thing in too much detail. I want to raise one point which people should think about. And I mean, I'm just asking you to think about it. I mean, in my mind, and I'm not criticizing people who've done this because a lot of people have uncovered a lot of very important things. But a lot of the investigations, and I'm not talking about the Warren Commission, I'm talking about citizen investigations into the Kennedy assassination. A lot of them have focused on some of the forensic details, the rifle that was used, the bullet wounds to Kennedy, things like this. And I am not saying those are unimportant. Other people have done investigations into the CIA and what have you, and it's very clear elements of the CIA were involved in the Kennedy assassination. I'm not saying the CIA as a whole, but there was certainly connections there. But I want to raise something else, which is that most people who are listening to this show, watching this show, are probably aware that the Kennedy assassination was over 60 years ago, and during this entire time, there was only one court case to try to bring someone to trial for involvement in the Kennedy assassination. And that was the court case in New Orleans by Jim Garrison, the district attorney of New Orleans, with the indictment of Clay Shaw. This is the one that, Oliver Stone made into his movie, JFK. Now, I think Stone's movie was pretty good, but again, it's a Hollywood movie, so you have to take that into account. What's better is to, if you can get a copy of it, is read Jim Garrison's book. He wrote a book about what he did. And the book was then the basis for the Oliver Stone movie, but the book is better. But this is very interesting to me. Jim Garrison indicted a man named Clay Shaw for being involved in the Kennedy assassination. Now, how many people do you know who have actually asked themselves the question, okay, he indicted Clay Shaw, but who the hell was Clay Shaw? Who was this guy? Who was this guy? And no one ever talks about him, And Clay Shaw has a very interesting background and very interesting connections. He was in the OSS during World War II, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, or what became the CIA. He was stationed in London, where he was actually the OSS liaison to Winston Churchill, right, the British Prime Minister. So he's not an unimportant guy in the OSS. He's the official liaison to Winston Churchill. 1 year after the end of World War II, in 1946, Shaw founded something called the International Trade Mart, based in New Orleans. And that was his company. And the International Trade Mart was not a real company. It was essentially a front for operations by the intelligence community of money laundering and channeling untraceable money into various intelligence projects. And this is what Shaw was running. But then in 1958, the International Trade Mart was taken over. It was bought up and taken over by another company called Permindex, which is the Permanent Industrial Expositions. So, and Clay Shaw then became a senior member of the board of directors of Permindex. So Clay Shaw is on the board of directors of Permindex. Who's Permindex? Most people have never heard of it, let alone do they know what it was involved in. Well, among other things, in 1967, Permindex was banned from doing business in Italy, France, and is more Italy, France, and Switzerland. They were banned from doing business in Italy, France, and Switzerland, and their offices, which they had offices in Italy, France, and Switzerland, were shut down, forcefully shut down by the French, Italian, and Swiss governments. Why? Because evidence had come to light through French Secret Service, French intelligence, that Permindex had been directly funding assassination attempts against Charles de Gaulle in Italy and in France. The Day of the Jackal and all that. Permindex had been funding these secret army organization assassination plots and assassination attempts, actual attempts against Charles de Gaulle, and that Permindex was probably also involved in the assassination of Enrico Mattei in Italy, this oil leader in Italy, who was a key ally of John F. Kennedy's. So Permindex is named as financing assassins. They're named as it, right? And Clay Shaw is on the board of directors of Permindex. So this is what Garrison was beginning to peel away the onion layers on. Who's really behind this? Now, another thing Permindex did was they created something called the Caribbean Anti-Communist League. This was created and funded by Permindex. They created the Caribbean Anti-Communist League. Well, where is the Caribbean Anti-Communist League based? It was based in the office of Guy Bannister in New Orleans, the former FBI agent who was working with Clay Shaw, who was, directly implicated by Jim Garrison in the assassination plot against John F. Kennedy. So there's a lot of other things you can go into. You can go into, was Lee Harvey Oswald, really part of the assassination plot, whether he was the lone shooter or didn't shoot it, or was he involved in that? Or was Lee Harvey Oswald actually a patriot who was trying to stop? There's all kinds of things you can go into. And I don't claim to have the answers to all of them. But if you look at the fact that this entire thing came out of Permindex and Permindex related organizations. And the other thing I should mention, which is I said that Clay Shaw was put on the board of directors of Permindex, okay? But he didn't run Permindex. He was not the president or CEO of Permindex. The founder and the president of Permindex was a man named Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield. Now, who's Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield? Because Clay Shaw is basically working under Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield. Who is Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield? Well, he had been very active in the British Special Operations Executive during World War II. He later became a member of what's called the 1001 Club, which you can look it up. It's a very elite group of basically drawn from the inner circles of the British and Dutch monarchies, operating out of London. Later in his career, he became inducted into the most venerable order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. Now, people may not know what that is, but that is an exclusive, very exclusive royal honor bestowed by the British monarchy in for people. I mean, forget this thing about getting, the Order of the British Empire. If you're inducted into the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, you are being recognized as being honored and recognized, brought into the innermost circle of people who have serviced the monarchy and the British Empire, right? That's Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield. He's running Permindex. Clay Shaw is essentially working for him. Clay Shaw is running the operations out of Bannister's office in New Orleans. This is what Jim Garrison, was beginning to uncover. And if you look at what was done to Garrison, I mean, his investigation was slammed down. He was attacked, slandered. You know, everything was done in the U.S. news media, right, to stop what Garrison was doing. And but this is what he was getting into, not just who pulled the trigger. You know, were there people shooting behind, from under the overpass or shooting from behind the fence? I'm not saying that stuff's not important, but Garrison was getting at the command structure behind the assassination. And certainly it involved people in the U.S. intelligence community, but the command structure goes back to Permindex, to Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield, to an individual who is given the highest honors imaginable by the British monarchy. So, and again, forget debating the details. Look at what Kennedy was doing. Look at what he was doing in the world. He was going to pull our troops out of Vietnam. He had a massive economic development program for the United States. He was developing friendly relations with countries all over the world. And then you look at he was unleashing the space program in the United States, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, the greatest scientific challenge in human history.
He wanted friendly relations with the Soviet Union.
Friendly relations. That was the whole thing about the American University speech. He was saying at American University, read the speech. He was saying, we are going to end the Cold War now. We're going to end it. 15 years of this is long enough. We're going to get past it. We're going to develop friendly relations with the Soviet Union.
And Robert, on the other side of that, on the other side of the pond, you've got Britain, which has a long-standing hostility and antipathy towards Russia and the Soviet Union.
Right.
And the Mackinder heartland theory that they want to get control of the Eurasian island, and therefore they get to control the whole world, and they want access to Russia's rich natural resources.
Right.
Okay.
That's right.
And I can see many, many parallels with what's happening today. And Robert,
it's a lot of stuff, huh?
It's a lot of stuff, right? But the thing that I struggle with, like when I talk to people, I'm an unreconstructed. Well, I suppose I'm a bit reconstructed, and these things don't apply anymore, right? But I'm from the left wing, in the British traditional left wing, and I'm passionate about opposing war. And when I say to my friends and family members and stuff, look, Trump's anti-war, not a pacifist, but he's anti-war. No, he's Hitler. You don't understand. No, he signed a peace treaty between Rwanda and Congo. Yeah, but look what he's doing here. That's nothing compared to what Obama and Bush have done.
Yeah.
Anti-war, right? And I can't get it. People, they lack, or they seem to have this inability to discern from whatever they've got going on to actually just look at the facts.
Yeah, it's Trump derangement syndrome, because, I mean, if you look at Obama, if you look at Bush Jr., if you look at Bill Clinton, even, with the war in Kosovo and all of that, but then what went on later was even much worse, obviously. And then you look at Trump. I mean, we have had a policy now of ongoing warfare for more than 20 years. If you go back to the Clinton administration, ongoing warfare, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And Trump is saying no more war. I'm going to help nations negotiate peace among themselves. He is an anti-war peace president. And that's not an opinion. That's something which is empirically provable. But yet you have these people who just,
like, they've been MK Ultra'd by the mainstream media.
Yeah.
Which
reality doesn't exist.
Owned by BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard, the major shareholders. And then, of course, they're owned by the banks, and it all goes back to the central banking system with the City of London at the nexus of it all. Robert, yeah. I said to you, Robert, I'm going to say something about you. You're a very, very bad man. You're a very, very bad man, because I said, we got an hour for this, right? But it's been absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, we've gone over an hour.
We have. I didn't want to stop. It's like, oh my God. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. And I'd recommend people go check out the book. By the way, I was kidding about you being a bad man. All right, just so you're clear. I don't want
Yeah,
people.
I just one final plug. I won't hold up any more.
No, you plug away.
I've written 12 books. I think people would like some of them. They're not like most other about half of the books are on American history and biographies of American leaders. Other books are on different things. There's one called Unconditional Surrender: Winning the War on Drugs in the 21st Century, which goes into the war against the drug trafficking. So they cover a variety of topics. But those books are all available on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, and on Kobo for people who use Kobo. So in both print format and ebook format, and I would encourage you to buy my books. And otherwise, if you do not follow Promethean Action, if you are not a subscriber to the Promethean Action website, I strongly urge you to do that.
Absolutely, and I echo that sentiment. Robert, it's been absolutely fascinating. Really, really appreciate this. I've learned so much, so thank you. Everybody who's watching, if you have any comments or questions or whatever, please put them in the description below. And please subscribe and all that business. And also check out Robert's books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Kobo, and also PrometheanAction.com. This is Rich and Robert signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.